Jonathan Sessler. So Professor Sessler is, since 2016, he's been the Doherty Welsh Centenary Chair at the University of Texas, Austin. He's a CSSM co-PI as well. He earned a BS in chemistry from UC Berkeley and a PhD from Stanford with Jim Coleman. He was an NSF, concurrent NSF, NATO, and CNRS postdoctoral fellow with Jean-Marie Lane in Strasbourg, and JSPS. He had a JSPS visiting professorship in Kyoto University as a postdoc, following the postdoc with Jean-Marie Lane. More to the point for today's presentation, Professor Sessler is a 3-time cancer survivor. His first diagnosis was Hodgkin's disease, and it came at age 20. At age 23, he was re-diagnosed and suffered through a then record of 9 cycles of chemotherapy. The experience left him with a permanent vendetta against cancer, as one might imagine. He has spent much of his professional life studying new approaches to anti-cancer drug development. With this later goal in mind, he didn't hesitate to co-found a company with his former oncologist, Dr. Richard Miller, Pharmacyclics, which was acquired by AbbVie for $21 billion in 2015. And to work closely with clinicians to bring 2 of his taxifrins, referred to as M-gadolinium and M-lutetium, through phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, respectively. As chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for Pharmacyclics through 2011, he played a key role in the in-licensing and initial development of Imbruvica, a drug that by now has been used to treat 200,000 patients worldwide. In 2014, Professor Sessler suffered a 3rd cancer diagnosis from which he has now apparently fully recovered. His latest technology is a platinum-4 taxifrin conjugate, and it's the basis of a new company, Oncotex. Financing for Oncotex is in place to allow development through phase 1 clinical testing. And so today, Professor Sessler is going to be speaking to us about intellectual property issues for academic scientists, clearly an area that he has a tremendous experience. And so we're so happy to have you sharing with us, Jonathan, your experience and your expertise in this area. Please.
Well, thank you. So yeah, it's really a delight to be able to participate in this CSSM Ambassador Program. A particular joy for me is that I'm the warm-up act for Dr. Roger Petman, who really helped me survive that terrible year of chemotherapy when I was in my early 20s and doing chemotherapy in the day. And if I recovered, I could do chemistry in the lab at night. And of course, through him, I became familiar with Fraser and supramolecular chemistry. And Dr. Petman helped me get a postdoc in Jean-Marie Lane's lab. And the rest is some sort of history, whether good or bad, you can judge. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the issues that we might face as academic scientists. So I'm not a patent lawyer, I'm not a patent agent, but I have friends who are, and occasionally I have to be somewhat knowledgeable in these areas. So I'll try and impart some of the ins and outs of how this works. And I want to start by thanking Kirby Drake, who's both a PhD and has a law degree. She's really a dynamo. She's an independent patent, runs a patent firm out of Dallas. She's also the chair of the American Chemical Society Committee on Patents and Related Matters. And so some of these public outreach slides that I'm showing have been put together for that committee, mostly thanks to her great effort. Reed Long is the patent agent. He's getting his law degree now, but right now he's an agent. You can't become a patent lawyer until you have a law degree. And some of the materials come from him, and some I put together myself. And then as time permits, I'll finish up with a little bit of the story that Eric told you about how we got started at Pharmacyclics and where that went and what we're trying to do now. So the bottom in yellow on this slide has a reference to Nature Biotechnology. That paper just came out quite recently. And again, it's a guide for patenting, again, with an academic bent. So the advantage or disadvantage of pinching materials from patent lawyers and patent agents is they see this a little bit differently than we might see it. So as the people presumably making the inventions, creating the new incipient technologies, are part of this game is a little bit different than those that manipulate and argue, and we're much more early stage. And so I'll try and focus on that. See if my, so types of intellectual property, I'm going to focus mostly on patents, but the people who do this for a living, they deal with these 3 or 4 types of intellectual property. So patents convey the right to exclude other people from pursuing or practicing your invention. We'll talk and emphasize that a patent is not freedom to operate, because there could be overlapping patents. So you may invent the telephone, but you needed to use a wire, but somebody else has a patent on the wire. So they can't come and make a telephone, but you might not necessarily be able to use your telephone without infringing their patent for a wire. Trademarks are mostly in the commercial sector. They identify a unique source of goods and services. Often these are a name, and they can be quite strong and long-lived. And many of the brands that you know easily recognize, so people pay a lot to have a well understood brand. And a copyright protects you from copying a printed matter. So it's very narrow but long-lived. And anyone who's tried to put together a review article knows that you have to go and get copyright permission to reproduce figures. But if you replot the figure from the fundamental data, or you go back to the X-ray data bank, the CDC, Cambridge Crystallographic Data Center, CCDC, and get the coordinates and make your own figure, then you're not violating copyright. So that's a form of matter, but not the matter itself. So think of it as how the data is presented, but not the data. And trade secrets are potentially indefinite, and maybe the secret recipe for McDonald's sauce or Coca-Cola. These are examples of trade secrets. So, but we'll focus mostly on patents after we give a little introduction. So trade secrets are information, can obviously have economic value. They're not readily known, they're not readily ascertainable, and you have to make a reasonable effort to keep it secret. And so you'll see things like non-disclosure agreements. So maybe if you're working with some other commercial entity, they'll make you sign a non-disclosure agreement that you won't take what they have, and all kinds of information can be that, and could be a computer code that you don't want anybody to know, and that gives you. And so copyright, we do see this, as I said, when we submit to the journal. And if you were online yesterday for Professor George Schatz's presentation, he talked about some of the ethical issues and some of the copyright issues. So you assign copyright when you write a paper, and the journals maintain that. And you have to certify that it's yours and you can assign it. And every once in a while, we'll try and put together a journal cover or something, and we might hire an artist, and we have to get him or her to give us the copyright or buy the copyright so that we can give it. And if you pinch stuff off the web and try and put it into your table of contents graphic, often you'll get dinged. So the RSC and the ACS both have people who check, and we just submitted a paper, who knows what will happen to it. And it had a little mouse, and the ACS people said, "Oh, that mouse, do you own that mouse figure?" And we go, "No, it was part of PowerPoint, and you go, well, do you have permission from Microsoft to put it in the paper, and blah, blah, blah. And a few years ago, we made a Rubik's Cube, and took us about 3 months to get the paper through the referees and accepted. It took us about 6 months to get the copyright permission from Rubik's Cube Incorporated to have a picture of a Rubik's Cube, even though it was made out of hydrogel. So copyrights don't so much affect us, but we're not completely exempt. Whereas trade secrets, probably we don't have anything to do with those. So let's get to patents. And again, the disclaimer, I'm not a patent lawyer. I'm not a patent agent. I've done a lot of expert witness work for patent cases. So I have some pretty good lay understanding. But if a real question, consult a lawyer. It's like the charities, if you donate kindly to your church or mosque or something, you get a tax letter saying you donate $100 or whatever. And it always says for tax advice, consult your lawyer. So I'm just putting that caveat in. Thomas Edison holds the record for most patents. How long that will last, who knows? So there are people, Lander at MIT is making a good run for it. Number 2 is still, I think, John Lamb. So Polaroid maybe is number 2. But Thomas Edison, light bulb, of course, we use little memes for a light bulb or icon when we have some nice, great idea. And so what are the patents? Why do we have them? How do people get patents? And because it's involving intellectual property as opposed to real property, there are often disputes that are resolved by jury or judge. And that happens also with real property. Oh, I own that creek. No, you moved the fence onto my line. Well, I've always been going to that beach, therefore I have rights to that. So there are real disputes for property as well, tangible property as well as for intellectual property. So the idea of patents is actually enshrined in the Constitution to promote the progress of science and useful arts. I'm a chemist. I suppose most of the people on this call are chemists. So maybe the most interesting thing about patents, in my view, is patent number 1, which was to Samuel Hopkins. And I don't know if you can recognize this signature. Here's G-W-A, it's George Washington. July 31st, 1790, patent number 00001. It's for potash. So the number 1 export from the, I guess now, independent colonies was potassium hydroxide. And how did you get that? You got that by burning hardwood. Why in the world do you need KOH? I think all the organic chemists know, use that to promote so-called saponification or hydrolysis of esters. It's a stoichiometric reagent. And if you take a fatty acid, and presumably soap, who knows, was discovered by people rotating a nice greasy lamb or ham or whatever they had in the paleo days, and grease falling into the ashes, then water coming along, maybe a rainstorm where they doused the fire, and they got this substance that instead of getting them dirty, got them clean. And KOH is the limiting reagent until Berthelot came along with hydrolysis and we could get sodium hydroxide from electrolysis. This was a limiting reagent. And of course, the early United States had lots of trees and they would chop them down. The hardwood was much better. And the Brits discovered that the oak that went into the first few American ships was much better than the growth trees they had in Europe, which were second growth or third growth, whereas the original growth trees were much harder. So the KOH was major commodity. That was that patent. Okay, so that's probably the most interesting thing we're going to learn today about patents. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. It grants to the persons having title to this patent the right to exclude others from making, using, or offering for sale or selling the invention. So that's the law or legality. But it's 20 years from the date of filing. In older patents, it was 17 years from the date of issue. That was not commensurate with the rest of the world. So the United States moved closer to being in line with the rest of the world. And this 20 years from date of filing obviated a lot of disputes, because in the old days, it was who invented it first. And maybe the most famous case I'm aware was, because I grew up in Berkeley, California, Charlie Towns, when I was a kid, formative years, won the Nobel Prize for the laser. But then there was a big patent dispute, and Texas Instrument actually prevailed on the patents because they could show that they invented it first by their laboratory notebooks. And so Towns was not stripped of the Nobel Prize. He kept the Nobel Prize, but all the money for lasers, or a lot of it, went to Texas Instruments because they were able to show that. But nowadays, it's 20 years from the date of filing, and I was in a patent dispute between a Scottish firm and a French firm, and the Scottish firm, same patent basically, but they filed a day earlier, and it went on and on and on, and eventually they prevailed. There was a lot more to it, but the fact that they were one day earlier gave them a leg up in the dispute, that they maintained a kind of a lead in the race they maintained throughout the patent fight. So it excludes, and it gives the owner of the patent, which is often not, almost always not the patent inventor. So this is property. And just like if you own a bar of gold, which we'll hear about in the next talk, you could sell that or buy another piece of gold. So this is considered property, and you can sell it for as much as you can get if you own the rights, or you can buy somebody else's patents and then see if you can make money off of it. So the patentee obtains the right to exclude others from practicing the invention for a limited time. And as I said, it's 20 years from date of filing, typically. So there's some extensions, particularly in the drug, where regulatory delays can occur. But 20 years is a good enough number for us. But it's not an affirmative right to practice the invention, because there can be overlapping rights. So again, coming back to these sorts of silly analogies, you invent the kite, wonderful, let's go fly it. Oh, but you need some string, but somebody else owns the patent on string. So that they can't come and make your kite, even though they own string, but you can't fly your kite without their string or some other workaround. So there's statutory categories. So it has to be a composition, method, or article of manufacture. And chemists, we're usually making a composition. Sometimes we describe a new method. So if you're a methodology synthetic chemist, maybe you come up with a better way of doing transamidation or something like that. And that would be a method, because the starting amide, the final amides are probably known compounds, but getting from one to another is new. But generally, the big payoff in chemistry is you make a new compound, you can get a patent for that, and basically you own the intellectual property for that molecule. Sometimes you can get related claims, and that's always an issue. So I make the ethyl, methyl, propyl, butyl, futyl, whatever we always joke, but does that give me the benzyl? And so sometimes you can say, okay, this claims that, but then sometimes somebody will argue no. And so that's where a lot of these fights. We were told yesterday that novel doesn't go into the title of a journal article, but it better be in your patent. So it has to be never produced nor performed before. And so if you think you bring a brand new molecule, you do a literature search, but then boom, somebody found that molecule and was published in some obscure abstract, you're in trouble. So it has to be really novel and not done, made, produced, or performed before. It can't be obvious, even if it's novel, and the difference can't be trivial. So again, I may not be able to get the patent for my molecule that I had, the methyl ethyl propylbutyl futyl whatever, but not the benzyl. But somebody comes along and makes the benzyl, they may not be able to get a patent because it would have been obvious to change the substituent on my amide, since that seems to be what's on my brain today. And so even though it wasn't done, it may have been obvious as the next N+1 step. So you can begin to see why lawyers love this area, because there's lots of room for arguing, for disagreeing, and it's not always so clear cut. In the affirmative sense, yes. So if you have something that's new, it's never made before, you can get a patent. But everybody's always trying to broaden the scope of their patents, or here's a useful patent, they're going to come right next to it. And that happens all the time in industry. So there'll be one nice thing and everybody will come and patent right around that in the hopes that that will lock in, or they can get the same properties. And you have to support it by evidence that can be reproduced by others. So this is really where we come in as academic chemists. This is just some of the fine print. So it can't be patented or put on sale before the effective filing date. It can't be described by some other inventor. So in the US, we get a year. So you can give a paper, public disclosure, but you get 1 year grace period. That's not true in the rest of the world. So if I told you today, oh, I just made chemical XQZ, which has never been made before, because XYZ has been made, but XQZ has never been. That's it. No patent in the rest of the world, but I'd have a year in the US to go file a patent, as long as I was the one disclosing it and it's my invention. So obviousness must be different from prior art, can't be so trivial. And people talk a lot of people of ordinary skill in the art. So that's somebody who doesn't have much creative ability, but knows all the literature. So this is the walking encyclopedia. But they can't say, oh, A plus B, therefore we can invent gamma in a new language, because that would be the next sequence. They might be able to go A, B, next would be C. And you have to teach it, and you have to have a likelihood of success, and it has to be useful. It can't be just a natural phenomenon. So this obviously has big impact on e-commerce, medical diagnostics. So you can't just go and fish out something, some new receptor or some new enzyme and patent it. So the basic rule, it has to be substantially different from a natural product. And the basic rule is by hand of a man or woman. So I can't just fish out an enzyme and patent it. I could fish out an enzyme, suddenly make it compatible with a new solvent like THF and able to operate at 100 degrees without denaturing. That would be, in my lay understanding, inventive. There's obviously a lot of flux here. A lot new court cases are changing the landscape all the time. So you have to have a description written in the description. You have to have an enablement, how to make it. And you have to have evidence that you actually had your invention. So the ideas don't count. You have to actually show that it works, and you have to really teach the world. And that's the trade-off. That was the constitutional trade-off, is you get this limited monopoly in exchange for teaching the world your invention. So after the early days, 17 years, nowadays 20 years, then it become generic drug, which is obviously potent chemical example. And so this impacts early stage research because we have to have this written description. We have to have be able to prove we possess the invention. So there are two parts to this conception. So the idea is key, but it has to be reproducible by others without undue experimentation. And you have to show that you actually reduced it to practice. So I think we all have the idea that we'll make a COVID-19 vaccine. That's a wonderful conception, but it's not patentable till we reduce it to practice. And the question is really where it can be reproduced by others and how much reduction to practice is needed prior to filing. So I just started the day by making a cup of coffee. My dad used to joke that in order to make coffee, all I had to do was boil water. He was a theoretical physicist, because once he had boiled water, it was well known that with boiling water, you could make coffee. And therefore he was done, at least in terms of a formal theoretical physicist's proof of coffee. So if it's really clear that once you have boiling water, you can make coffee, then you don't need so much reduction to practice. But what's clear to one might not be to another. But if you wait too long, somebody might file the day before you, as happened to the poor French versus Scottish company. I was involved in that case a year or two ago. So the threshold is inventorship, is who conceived the invention. That's much more important than reduction to practice, because often reduction to practice involves routine steps like showing we make a molecule, we think it's going to be great against cancer. We have to do cell testing. That cell testing is pretty routine. You don't have the invention until you really show it worked, but that part is maybe not inventive. So the reduction to practice is very instructive, whether it was complete, whether you really possessed the invention. Here's a key thing. Authorship does not equal inventorship. So I was complaining I'm in a big fight about various things. And one of the issues is authorship versus inventorship. And I'm not an inventor, but I am an author, and that has all kinds of implications, I think. You can't, authorship, we're still trying to figure out. We talked about ethics, the section B11 of that ethics code of the ACS starts by anybody who made it contributions, substantive intellectual experimental contribution should be an author. That's up to everybody to sort of decide, but inventorship's a legal determination. Did you conceive and reduce this to practice? Everybody, we talked a little bit in the publishing about high impact journals, but there's also a lot of cachet being associated with being first author, but there are no first inventors. All inventors are equal, and they all have the rights and privileges associated with the patent. And that can lead also to some disputes. So it's important to establish invention date, record the events. It should include sufficient information to figure out when it was conceived and when it, and bound, numbered notebooks. If you really think you're onto something, make sure to have a non-inventor countersign. The date of invention is now less critical than it used to be because it's going to be the date of filing. But as I mentioned, big issues involving who actually owns it used to be based on who had the best notebooks or could show that. As a university researcher, in fact, most researchers that have a job are contractually obligated to convey the rights to their invention to their employer. For us, that's the university. And that's been the subject of many, many court cases, and there's not much leeway. So you may be working for Professor Shelter, and you're doing all this wonderful magnetism, and suddenly you go into your shower and you say, well, I wonder if magnetism could be useful to separate different components in the shampoo. I'm going to go file a patent on that. Penn still owns it because it's related to what you do. And you think, if you're out jogging and you suddenly come up with a new design for kite sailing. Well, maybe, because that's not chemistry. You might be able to show that that really was different from your day job. Often sponsored research agreements give away the rights in exchange for money, especially, and the government retains certain rights, which they rarely exercise. So if you're collaborating, often you'll have a material transfer agreement, which sets out the intellectual property issues in advance, presumably. And then there are licenses. So you have this wonderful invention, exclusive versus non-exclusive. And Microsoft's a wonderful example of non-exclusive license. So they'll let everybody use it so they can give it away many, many times. Exclusive license, you're only going to let one person practice that. And that's much more common in the pharmaceutical industry because nobody wants to put all the money into developing a drug when the same different company right down the street can have the same rights. So if you're doing a startup, you have to worry about funding, conflicts of interest, things like that. At Texas, we do research. We write a disclosure. And here's the Thomas Edison little light bulb. This goes to our Office of Sponsored, Office of Technology and Commercialization. They evaluate this. Maybe they give some feedback. They do some preliminary marketing. Maybe they go ahead and do an initial patenting, but it's not going where they'll inactivate it quickly. They find somebody to negotiate, they'll try and license. And so their goal, of course, and this is where we interface as investigators, is with our technology license people. And they want to get as much to the benefit of the public and the university. So they'll assess patentability. What are the advantages? What's the value proposition? Is there things out there? So that we have to do it, and this is probably the most relevant rubber hits the road for you guys, is we have to do a information disclosure. So we're not actually doing the patent. What we're trying to do is convince our technology licensing officers that we have something worth investing in. So they send a form, you fill out this intellectual property questionnaire, they'll look at it. It serves as documentation of your invention. You can list it in your CV. It's certainly something real. And then they may assign it to a patent agent or attorney to get further information. So they're going to ask who did this, all who served in the inventive process, and they will vet this. So did so-and-so just do the mouse studies? Did so-and-so just run the NMR? Did they run the X-ray? Or did they really say, oh, based on this X-ray structure, you need to put this modification? And then that becomes presumably an inventive step. You need all this stuff. What's critical to know is failure to include inventor can actually invalidate a patent. And certainly over my 35 years, I've had cases where I've, for one reason or other, students have come and complained that they should have been on the paper. We write a retraction or add their name to the paper. That same sort of process can be done in a patent, but if you don't do it, and that individual comes back and says, well, I was part of that invention, I'm not on the patent, and they're working for your opposition, boom, bye-bye patent. So it's pretty serious. You have to describe the invention. This is just sort of questions. And again, time is short. I don't want to read all this, but this is being recorded and you can access it. What does it solve? How does it differ from? And so this is, again, it's to assess novelty. And the Bayh-Dole regulations, that was what really launched biotechnology. Is this said that the universities could own patents to inventions. Prior to that, they were all in the public domain. So that's really coincides with the rise of biotech over the course of my lifetime. Again, what's it good for? They want to make sure that where you did it they want to make sure that public disclosures, journal, please note, in bold, poster sessions, abstracts, oral presentation, all are disclosures. And if you did that, then you're going to be limited to getting a US patent. You can't get an international patent. Do you have lab books, relevant journal articles? Are you aware of any prior art? So they want to know all that. Who paid for it? That's always important. Sponsors, because they may have rights to the invention. And in fact, one of the ones we just did was funded by the Cancer Prevention Research Institute of Texas, which has sort of been wiped out by COVID. But they own 2% or something, and we had to pay them, we being the University of Texas, not me. Then you have to give something that they can use for marketing. Then the university might give you the green light to proceed. They'll do a provisional versus non-provisional decision, and they'll take care of it from there. Then there's all the fighting back and forth, office actions. So that's basically an examiner. They'll make an appeal, might be allowance. You have to, even post-grant, there can be reviews of patents. Somebody comes up with new information. So universities usually file a provisional patent application. If you haven't made a disclosure at all, then you get this 1 year of grace. If you've already disclosed it, then you have to go straight to a real patent. There's a huge difference in cost. And so universities will usually do a provisional patent. They have 1 year, and then they sort of assess whether anybody's going to actually buy it. And if not, they won't go ahead and put in a real patent. So this is on the order of 5 to 10K. A real patent is on the order of 15 to 30K. So there's a form. By now, we're sort of out of it. The patent agents and lawyers take over. But once I got to go there, some nice patent award thing, I got to go there. It's kind of cool. You see, nice library. So these are things that attorneys take over. And you have to swear to buy this. So it's authorized that you did this, and penalty of perjury and all that. So you have an abstract, you have a written description, which you actually lay out all the aspects of your invention. You try and extend it as much as you can, although not illustrated. We think they're first form, blah, blah, blah. Another embodiment description. And so these claims are where it's all about. So you claim a versatile wristwatch system comprising in patents mean having this, but they could have other stuff as well. So that's one of those buzzwords. Comprising for chemists and comprising for lawyers are different. So this means at least this, but maybe other stuff. And the idea is like a survey. It tells you what you have. So it defines the boundaries of the invention, must distinctly claim. The terms and phrases must be clear and have support in the rest of the patent, so it's clear to you get 18 months, and then your patent is published. So it's not allowed, but it's published. So after 18 months, the whole world knows what you're doing. You may not have an invention for it, but this now becomes prior art. Everybody knows what you did. And so it may cause apprehension. Other competitors may say, oh, no, now we know about that. We're not going to bother paying all the money for filing for a patent because we'll never win. After you file, you'll get communication back from the patent examiner. So this is a little bit like playing with referees for a journal. They'll reject it, and then they'll tell you why. You have to respond, and back and forth. And the lawyers do all this, but they'll come and ask you and say, please show us why you can do that. Where was it? And then you get a notice of allowance, issue fee. Somebody has to pay this. And again, this starts getting really expensive. So universities aren't going to go down this road unless they're pretty convinced somebody's going to buy it. Then there are all these fights. So the joke is that you don't really have a successful patent until you're sued. And often huge sums are, I'm on the pharmaceuticals side. And by the time you have $1 billion drug, you're going to pay $500,000 for, which is what one of these patent fights typically costs. The generics are always trying to come after these big drug patents, saying they're invalid for one reason or another, and they win about 1 time in 4, and that pays for the generic whole industry. So why do you want to do this? Lots of opportunities. Maybe you can create your own job. You can become proficient enough that you can be an expert witness. Jerry Atwood, who's one of the gods of inorganic chemistry, well, I think he makes, maybe I don't give a dollar figure because I'm being recorded, but I praise Jerry Atwood. And George Gokul is another one of the expert witnesses I've encountered, and remarkably good. My colleagues do this, and it's often enough to get your kids through college. So if you have a track record as an inventor and you like this idea of helping to teach the court, then that can be an opportunity. You can become a technical advisor for a law firm, which many, I'd say a number of my former students have started that, then they become patent agents or patent lawyers. And this is a really hot field, and it's very well paid. And I've never met a patent lawyer who's unhappy. I've met other lawyers who get burned out, but patent lawyers, every couple of years, you're on a new invention, and it's really fun. Okay, so why do I care about patents? I'll just tell this story that Eric told briefly, which is when I got to Texas, I realized that this class of molecules, porphyrin, was too small. So we invented texaphren, which was actually the first use of the term expanded porphyrin in the literature. There are a couple of dozen groups now worldwide doing this kind of chemistry. But the idea was that we would chelate the flag and we would match and we'd be bigger. So this is our Texas rabbits. They're bigger than normal. And we quickly found out that unlike porphyrin, the imine here made it very easy to reduce. It would be reoxidized and generate reactive oxygen species. And Dirk Gouldy helped us figure all that out. And that was him skiing at Squaw Valley with me a few years ago. So you heard that Dr. Miller was my former oncologist, and the time I was suffering through this chemotherapy, and Dr. Petman, our next speaker, would help with his wife Sheila, helping keep my spirits up. We decided we'd go with this molecule, and we got pretty far for radiation therapy, and it localized pretty well. And Dr. Miller kept saying, "Can you do anything good with your molecules?" So then we thought we could. Unfortunately, we got all the way through phase 3, and it was rejected because 2 of the 64 centers waited too long and skewed the p-value. There's still no real option. And so about this time, we were pretty depressed because I knew we were in trouble because I got on a plane in Paris. The stock was $20 a share. I got off the plane, it was $1.50 because they had announced the trial failed. I like this, doesn't call for a drink, but let's have one anyway. And of course, Homer Simpson to alcohol, which is the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. So, and as you heard, we pivoted at pharmacyclics and started developing ibrutinib, which is now Imbruvica, ibrutinib, generic versus trade name. It's being used to treat 40% of all leukemia patients. And I'll tell you a secret, the scientists don't get very much money, but I got a little tiny bit. And so I bought this nice lake house where I've been, and the water sometimes floods, sometimes drought, and there's a nice whiskey collection and good fun. So meanwhile, 2015, Pharmacyclics acquired by AbbVie. They're starting to burn all the old texaphren. And I really thought that there's still life in this molecule and it localizes well to cancer. And so this has been inspiring a long, but far from complete struggle to bring these compounds back into testing. So this isn't a chemical talk, it's just an entrepreneurial talk, but this localization is probably because it's going through leaky vasculature. So our idea was we'd use this for carrier. We started with cisplatin. Our collaborator at MD Anderson thinks that if we could double the dose of platinum to ovarian cancer without toxic symptoms, then we might double the 5-year survival. And so the idea is that this is hepatically cleared, these are renally cleared, so a lot of toxicity comes from that. So Arambula and Theobald, made this compound. That's US patent number 10406167. So there is a patent here. I'm not leaking something that's not in the previously patented. And this works remarkably well. I'm not going to go through all the details because I want to give some time, but it shows up, goes to cancer. It overcomes two dominant resistance mechanisms, one involving localization, one involving reactivation of dormant P53, which is a tumor suppressor. And let's just look at some mice studies. So these are patient-derived xenografts. This is a cancer model, came from a patient who died of ovarian cancer. And it's never seen glass, it's never seen plastic. It's kept alive in a mouse, and then you grow some up. And the treatment is carboplatin, but unfortunately, this patient passed away from this disease, and that doesn't really work, nor does just saline. But if you use ours, then really remarkably good. And this is a Kaplan-Meier curve. So that's the Henry Kaplan, who invented or introduced X-rays. And he was the first one to treat me before I was relapsed and put into the lap of Richard Miller. And you can see through the end of the study, it's pretty. And so this led to an Australian biotech company, IQ Global, licensing this back in September. And the patent is collaboration between MD Anderson and University of Texas. And I have to have a disclosure that I'm a director of this new company, which is, we're hoping to generalize beyond platinum. And so here's the full disclosure. And I think, let's read this, okay? I'm sure Dr. Petman doesn't mind if I take all his time to read this, but okay. Jokes aside, I have to always disclose that I have an interest in this company, and these materials are not intended as offer or solicitation with respect to purchase or sale, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And this has been cleared by lawyers as being an adequate disclosure. So everybody read this, and then we can go on. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about. I wanted to save some time for discussion and not start our morning by getting off pace. So I will try my best to answer any questions. And again, I urge you to look in more detail at a lot of the words in these slides at your leisure, or take a look at this Nature Biotechnology. But the bottom line for us as academics is, if you think you're onto something, make sure to sign and date your notebook and get somebody else to come and counter sign it. It's the date of the counter signature that counts, not yours. And if you don't do that, it's going to be much harder to substantiate when you really made the invention. That matters a little bit less now in the 20 years from filing, but you still might need to be able to prove you and not your friend Joe or Jane actually conceived and reduced the invention to practice. So hanging around the lab and discussing stuff is usually enough for papers, acknowledgement, co-authorship. It really depends, but that's decided among the peers. Patent inventorship is decided by law, so it's not willy-nilly, and you really be able to say, okay, here's my lab book. I did this on June 13th, happy Friday, and prove that. So that's maybe the most important, and then filling out the invention disclosure and do it. It doesn't count as done unless it's published, we heard yesterday, but it certainly can't ever be technology unless it's patented. Maybe there's some exceptions with trade secrets. So get in the habit. It's not hard. It doesn't cost you anything, and it can be a lot of fun. And patents count on your CV. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for that really interesting talk. I think that there's clearly some pertinence here, some connection between activities that are going on in the center and the contents of your presentation. And you know, one of the, as we were discussing in a PI meeting a few weeks ago, one of the measures that were assessed from the NSF is through this so-called innovation aspect. And so one of the ways that we can show innovation is by having invention disclosures that are coming out of the work that we're doing in the center. So I really appreciate that you brought that point up. And I think that's something that we can encourage for people to do in the course of writing academic papers across the work that we do in the center. So I want to encourage folks to type questions that they might have into the chat, and then we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself to ask your question. And we would, of course, love to hear from student, undergraduate, graduate student, and postdoc affiliates for the first question and for questions going forward. So please, if anyone has a question.
So Max from the shelter group at the University of Pennsylvania has a question. So I'm going to unmute him so that he can ask his question to Jonathan. Max, you're unmuted now.
Hey, Dr. Sessler, thank you very much for that talk. Really, really informative. And like we were saying, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. And like we were saying, really, really good story too, kind of like how we're talking about yesterday. So I had two questions. I was a little bit confused. What exactly is the difference between being an inventor on a patent and being listed as an author on a paper? Because you were talking about people being excluded from being on a patent. And I was wondering if there were any disadvantages to including as many people on a patent as possible, like other than just a line on your CV or something like that. Are there like other privileges or things like that that are associated with patents?
So if you have a superfluous person listed, that can also invalidate the patent.
Mm.
So again, I'm involved in some big fights, and one of these is centering around a paper where I'm an author, but I'm not an inventor on the underlying patent, and I'm being accused of various things. And one of my defenses is, look, I came and I made an intellectual contribution, helped write paper, but I'm not on this. I didn't conceive or reduce to practice this invention, as reflected in the fact that I'm not an inventor on the patent. So to make a better paper, I helped frame the story, made an intellectual contribution. Often some of this is language, some of this is sales, some of this is experience. So we heard from Professor Stoddard yesterday about how he was helping write up this thing that's going to come out Friday. I received it, but I haven't really done anything but glance at it and see a few friends talking. That may or may not be acknowledged. It may or may not be co-authorship. I don't know exactly how it played out, but that was clearly an intellectual. But that's different from being an inventor. So I could not, I'm holding up a watch. I did not conceive, I did not make this watch, but I could very well figure out a new way to sell this watch to Eskimos, and we could write something up about best practices for selling watches. Quite different, and so it's a legal distinction. Okay, watch means I should pay attention to time.
I just had one other just kind of quick question, more of a career thing also. Like, let's say that someone, has their 5, plus years on the PhD, all that stuff. And how much more like legal training do you need to get into the patent law field? Okay,
that's a wonderful question. And in fact, the slides I pinched from Reed Long were all about that. And I got rid of them because I'm not here to sell people on a career in that. You can start by being a technical advisor day one, if you know something. You have to have a technical degree in order to become a patent lawyer. So these are highly educated people. They know a lot of engineering, chemistry, physics, some technical degree, biochemistry. They then become jack of all trades. Usually they'll go from being a technical advisor to becoming a patent agent. It's about 1 year. You take an exam, it doesn't have to be a year, you could cram and do it right away. once you pass the exam, you can be a patent agent. Patent agents can't argue things in court. They can't give legal advice. They can do all the mechanics of, and then usually 4 years of night school. So the law degree is usually weak. The science degree is usually strong.
Makes sense.
So it's people like you, the 5-year PhD, you really know what you're talking about. Because it all comes down to really, was this novel was invented, and the law is important, but less important.
Mm-hmm.
So they're usually 3 years is for normal law school to be a lawyer, but usually people will do this progression. And so Reed's in its very final end of 4 years of part-time law school while still having a full-time job as a patent agent. And usually the firm pays for that.
Well, I see there's another question in the chat from Nikhil Chelam from Northwestern, from Shots Group. Let's see if we can find him.
Nikhil, you should be unmuted now.
Yeah, hi, can y'all hear me?
We can. Go ahead.
Alrighty. So I guess this is kind of a long question. There's actually a couple of podcasts that I've been listening to over the past couple of years about like the US patent system and the prevalence of patent trolls, which are corporations such as like intellectual ventures that kind of amass all these patents by small-time inventors or professors or other like kind of smaller corporations as a way to kind of file lawsuits against other companies that may have sort of infringed even slightly on other corporations. So, I mean, like, for example, one of the biggest examples is like small photo sharing companies, whereas like companies like Flickr or PhotoBucket and everything sue these smaller photo sharing companies for kind of infringing upon this overarching patent of uploading photos to the internet. And so I was wondering, to what extent have academics kind of gone around this, or like the extent to which specificity plays a role in academic patents? I don't know if that's kind of specific enough, but I was wondering your thoughts on this. This is a pretty long article, and it's a really good read if any of y'all are interested.
Yeah, you might share it with everybody. So that's a very serious issue, and the technology licensing offices of universities are very sensitive to that. And that's one of the things they always stress, is that we are not, at least at University of Texas, they always stress, we're not patent trolls. We're trying to make things that are useful, translation into show our mission for helping humanity. So they're not interested in filing that sort of patent. If they do not take up the invention, depending on where you are, it can be released back to the inventor. So there's certainly people who deliberately don't get their university to file patents so they can own it. Maybe the most famous example was John Fenn from Yale, electrospray ionization mass spectrometry, won a Nobel Prize. When he first did that, he poo-pooed it to the university, so they didn't file invention and released it back to them. And of course, he became very wealthy from that. They sued him and won as being not forthright in his, whatever it is, technology transfer, whatever, license, or whatever that filing, invention disclosure. So patent trolls certainly exist. I know some famous people, I won't mention them by name, who do that for a living and have done extremely well. So this is apocryphal. I haven't checked the facts, but one of these went around and was patenting all the deuterated versions of big drugs, and then coming and saying, okay, we're going to make that because it's the same. It wouldn't have to go through FDA. And there are others that go out and make patents on new methods of making, say, a generic drug, and they'll chop synthesis step out or two, and they'll try and get money from that. Sometimes they do. Okay. So this is like the short sellers on Wall Street. They're part of our ecosystem. We have to live with it, but we don't have to admire it.
The article that I was referring to is actually in the chat. I sent it out for everyone who wants to see it. And on another note, I want to say gig 'em rather than hook 'em. So I'm from Texas.
Okay.
I'll second that, Gigam. Jonathan, we're about out of time, but there's one more late breaking question from my colleague Jeff Saban here. Maybe I'll just read it real fast. Can you comment on how electronic notebooks required at many institutions impact your comments about discovery dates, countersignatures, physical locations of data, etc.? Do paper notebooks have any advantages?
So some of my coworkers use electronic notebooks, and part of what they provide is date stamp and patent level certification of the data. So that's a known issue. Much more in flux are these preprints. So you put it on Chem Archive. Does that count as the first public disclosure? And that still hasn't really worked its way through the courts, because a lot of those get changed. So somebody will say that, but then they change it. But the electronic notebooks, that's the good ones that have already addressed that issue. Okay, we better stop. Thank you.
Well, let's thank Jonathan again for a beautiful presentation, and thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'll just react here. There we go.